I will never fear to cite Cesare Borgia and his actions." These were the words, among many, of Niccolo Machiavelli in his political treatise, The Prince. The Italian diplomat was utterly mesmerized by the man he wrote so often and so graciously about. Machiavelli would even go as far as comparing his muse to other iconic and well-accomplished rulers, such as in the instance he wrote, "Alexander never did what he said. Cesare never said what he did." There were no bounds to how much Machiavelli admired the son of the Pope. So what was it about this man that captivated one of Italy's most famous diplomats in history? Who was Cesare Borgia, and why was he so special? Born in either 1475 or 1476 in Subiaco, as the illegitimate son of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, an Aragonese man by birth, and his Italian mistress Venozia dai Catani, Cesare Borgia would go on to become one of the most controversial and often vilified beings to ever walk the Italian lands. His family was far from seemly either, as his father, who would later become Pope Alexander VI in 1492, never even denied his affairs and illegitimate children, and was known as one of the most contentious popes to ever take the title. Yet, somehow, Cesare managed to stand out for his own nefarious acts, questionable morals showcased throughout his life and immortalized in the works of Niccolo Machiavelli. Initially, Cesare was raised to be in the church, as his father was, and was already made the Bishop of Pamplona at the age of 15, and Archbishop of Valencia 2 years later, followed by additional positions of Bishop of Castres and Bishop of Elne. Once his father had become Pope, Cesare would be promoted once more, scarcely an adult now at age 18, when he was next made a cardinal. He, though, did not like the church life at all, and really seemed to have little care for even his own faith. He, much like his father, was an utter failure when it came to his chastity vows, and his contracting syphilis at a young age underscored this problem. Cesare was also bothered by the entire concept of being put in the church, because this was reliant on the fact that Rodrigo greatly favored his other son Giovanni. The legacy of the Borgia family had been put on Giovanni's shoulders, not Cesare's. It was the other one who had been put in charge of the military and would take the glory, something that Cesare yearned for. Tensions may have reached their peak between the brothers, who had long since shared the same mistress, the wife of their younger brother, Geoffrey, and had a generally well-acknowledged rivalry in the early summer of 1497. It was at this point that their father decided to make Giovanni the first Duke of Benevento. Cesare was put in charge of a simple papal legate that would be sent to Naples. Cesare was growing increasingly tired of watching his brother succeed while he was forced to continue the churchly duties that he viewed as so tedious and unimportant. And although proof is only circumstantial, this may be why, a month later, Giovanni would go missing after dinner with his brother, and his body would later be found floating in the Tiber River, having been stabbed 9 times and his throat slashed. Whether this murder was done at the command of or by Cesare himself, or had nothing at all to do with him, it did, nevertheless, leave an opening that Cesare had relentlessly wished to fill. And so, he did. On August 17, 1498, Cesare Borgia would resign from his position as cardinal, something that has never been done before by any prior cardinal. Understandably, the decision had originally faced notable backlash from Cesare's colleagues, but thanks to his father's position and habit of corruption, a large enough majority of cardinals was eventually convinced to validate the decision. And finally, Cesare was free from the shackles of the Vatican. Now, both Rodrigo and Cesare were unified in their goals, and the first aim was for Cesare to obtain his own Italian state to rule over. To do this, the Pope opted to depose all of the vicars in charge within Romagna and Marche and replace them entirely with Cesare. Thankfully for the Borgias, despite resistance from the vicars, the locals were not fond of their previous rulers and in fact welcomed Cesare as their new leader. Cesare was also the commander of the Papal armies and Duke of Valentinois by this point, thanks to an alliance that his father had formed with the French. This new friendship with France also meant that Cesare was to marry the sister of the King of Navarre, who was a strong ally of France against Spain, who the Borgias had previously been aligned with but were no longer. And this whole debacle got complicated for Cesare startlingly fast. Cesare wanted to remain aligned with the French, who had supported his resignation and career change, even going as far as sending him troops for his campaigns in Italy. But Rodrigo was not so attached to France, and Cesare's sister, Lucrezia, was actually married to Alfonso, the cousin of King Ferdinand of Aragon. In signature Cesare fashion, a man who was described by Machiavelli as just the right amount of cruel, the decided solution was to simply murder Alfonso to cut all remaining ties with Spain. By 1499, Alfonso had become quite suspicious of such a scheme and had initially fled from Rome, but returned not long after for the birth of his and Lucrezia's son. Initially, nothing happened, and Alfonso's anxieties were fading. But after word got out that the Pope and Ferdinand may have been reconsidering their previous alliance, Cesare resolved that it was time to take action. He first sent a group of mercenaries, something he used often, to attack Alfonso as he entered St. Peter's Basilica. But thanks to the Spaniards' bodyguards, Alfonso managed to survive the attack. Profoundly aggravated by the botched assassination, Cesare now ordered his longtime friend and general, Micheletto Corella, and a few additional men to break into the room of the sleeping Alfonso as he recovered from his injuries and strangle him to death. This time, the murder was successful, and any chances at friendship with Spain had been dashed. Cesare had truly broken the heart of his beloved sister, but to him, it had all been worth it. The next target of the condottieri and commander was Imola, and then Forli, and Cesare would be backed by his own papal army, thousands of troops sent over from France, and additionally, Italian mercenaries. Capturing both cities was a success, although Forli proved to be a more dramatic conquest due to its leader, Caterina Sforza. Caterina had seen Imola fall to Cesare, and had given the citizens of Forli the option to surrender or fight once the Borgia and his men arrived. The people didn't know how to respond, and so Caterina freed them of their oaths of fealty, deciding instead to stand her ground alone, and only with those who voluntarily joined her. She then sealed herself into the fortress and would soon be under siege upon Cesare's arrival on December 19, 1499. The bombardment would continue until January 12, 1500, when Borgia's troops stormed the fortress and, despite her continued and valiant resistance, captured Caterina Sforza. At this point, the clever lady abruptly surrendered to Frenchman Antoine Bisset. That was because Caterina knew that French law did not allow women to be taken as prisoners of war. This seemingly smart decision backfired, though, when the French simply gave her over to Cesare, who insisted that she would be treated as a guest, though this is likely not what happened. Following the capture of Forli, Cesare's French troops had to be sent home, forcing Cesare to return to Rome early. Nonetheless, the former cardinal was greeted with enthusiasm and praise and was granted the title of Papal Gonfalonier by his father. Cesare would soon return to complete his campaigns to officially secure Romagna and Marche as his own, and it seems that nearly everywhere he went, his rule was well liked and had great approval, despite his use of brutality towards those who dared oppose him. He also managed to shake the final hold of the Aragonese power in the south when his men routed Fabrizio Colonna, and he would eventually capture the Republic of San Marino in 1503. Prior to the latter, though, some of Cesare's condottieri tried to overthrow him, forcing the Pope's new favorite son to take another pause to deal with this revolt. In a widely admired and respected act of cunning, Cesare eventually invited the men to meet with him, having offered a chance of reconciliation and compromise. The gullible generals agreed, and once they arrived, Cesare ordered them all to be arrested and eventually killed. Now having brought much of central Italy under papal control and wiping out any relevant oppression, Cesare had made a name for himself and his father and seemed to be on track for even greater success. But, in a turn of luck, deemed as such by Machiavelli, Cesare Borgia would sadly fall from grace at a rapid speed. Around the same time, both Pope Alexander and his son fell ill with what is believed to have been malaria. The Pope, unfortunately, succumbed to disease, but Cesare would manage to survive. Luckily for the latter, as he was too ill at the time to truly participate in puppeteering the election for the next pope, Pope Pius III was fond of the feisty Borgia and supported him as his own father had. In a streak of lesser luck, Pius died 26 days later, and with Cesare still weakened, his antagonistic rival, Giuliano della Rovere, was elected as Pope Julius II. Despite promising to leave the Borgia be, as soon as he was elected, Rovere turned on Cesare, stripping him of San Marino and eventually the rest of his lands in Romagna. Further adding insult to injury, upon his arrival in Naples, Cesare was arrested and thrown in jail, eventually being transferred to Spain. After 2 years there, somehow, the unrelenting Borgia managed to escape and flee to the safety of his brother-in-law in Navarre in 1506, and the latter quickly put him to work as a general. And it was this final assignment that would end Cesare's luck and life. In the early hours of March 11, 1507, while besieging the castle of Vienna, Cesare attempted to give chase to an isolated group of enemy knights, unaware that none of his own men had followed. Upon noticing the lone attacker, the rebels overpowered Cesare, dragging him from his horse and killing him. The knights, not realizing who he was, stripped him of his belongings and left his nude body, riddled with roughly 25 gaping wounds, lying in the middle of the road for his men to soon find. When the leader of this rebellious city, Luis de Beaumont, realized who his men had killed, he was outraged. Cesare was no mere man and would have been worth a hefty ransom, but now he lied dead in the road like a helpless animal. The tomb of the most controversial Borgia read, "Here in a scant piece of earth lies he whom all the world feared." Words that, along with one of the greatest praises from the writing of Machiavelli, truly emphasize what a powerful and history-altering man Cesare Borgia was. There was one man who showed glimpses of greatness, the kind of thing that made you think he was sent by God for the country's redemption.